He walked with slow, almost dragging steps, holding tightly an old military backpack, stained by time. Around him, luxury cars reflected the sun's glare on the impeccable parking lot of the city's most exclusive golf club. George Miller, 84 years old, had no status or important surname, just a simple invitation, and an old desire to relive memories that time had tried to erase. As soon as he stepped onto the lawn, the stares began. Restrained smiles, murmured comments, judgments disguised as etiquette. He didn't say a word. He simply placed his backpack under a tree, took out an old club, and, with a firm stance, hit a ball with impeccable precision. The sound of the shot cut through the silence of the course, like an echo from the past. But instead of respect, there was contempt. "This place is reserved for members, sir," whispered a voice full of superiority. What no one there knew is that this man carried something in his backpack that would change everything, and whoever was about to arrive would make the whole world stop and stare. George didn't answer. He just looked down, as if he had heard that too many times in his life. The manager, in a well-pressed suit and a condescending smile, crossed his arms in front of him, as if his presence were a system error. Behind him, a group of young players began to laugh without hiding it. One of them even recorded the whole thing with his cell phone, muttering mockingly, "Look, Grandpa invaded the green." George took a deep breath. His fingers, stained by the sun and decades of effort, held the club delicately, as if it were a sacred artifact. And in a way, it was. This same club had accompanied him to military bases, in times of silence between explosions, when golf was the only moment of peace in the midst of war. He used it to teach concentration to young recruits. Not as a sport, but as a way to survive the chaos. But nobody there knew about it. Nobody wanted to know. He bent over slowly, putting the bat back in his backpack, and as he did so, the small medal hanging from the zipper jiggled discreetly. It was simple, dull, but it carried stories that no trophy from that club could tell. And yet, one of the boys kicked George's ball away, laughing loudly, as if he had made the joke of the year. At this point, tell me, have you ever felt like you were in the right place, but were treated like you didn't belong? Have you ever had to swallow your pain just to maintain your dignity? If this touched you in any way, comment below. Share what you felt, or tell a story that left an impression on you. This helps this channel continue to tell these stories. Stories that the world needs to remember. And if you also believe that respect and honor have no age, please like and subscribe to the channel. It is thanks to you that these voices gain strength. But all of this was still just the beginning, because what no one expected was about to happen. And the arrival of an unexpected figure would change the course of everything. George wasn't the type to cry easily, not after everything he'd seen. But at that moment, as he walked in silence, escorted by 2 security guards in suits who wouldn't even look him in the eye, something was breaking inside him. And it wasn't physical. It was as if the dignity he'd earned hard on distant battlefields was being pushed out the door by hollow laughter and gratuitous contempt. With every step, the manicured ground of the golf club felt more hostile than the deserts where he'd once fought. The muffled sound of expensive sneakers on the grass was interrupted only by the loose phrases that came from behind, like discreet stabs. "It should be a crime to let people like that in. I think you confused it with the city park." George clutched the strap of his backpack to his chest. Inside, beyond the old bat and the forgotten medal, was a folded photo of him and his son at a spring picnic, smiling before an American flag. The boy was only 7 years old. He had never really known him as a man, as a soldier. He had grown up with his mother while George served. And now, even though he was old, even though he was tired, he was still trying to find meaning in civilian life. But times like these, it was hard. It was hard not to wonder if all that effort was really worth it. As they left the field, one attendant whispered to another, trying to contain his laughter. Maybe he thought he was a real veteran. Those words. Those words hurt like a grenade exploding in his chest. It wasn't just disrespect. It was erasure, a kind of violence that doesn't bleed, but corrodes. George stopped for a moment and looked back. His eyes filled with a restrained light, not of anger, but of deep-rooted sadness. Inside, he relived scenes that few could bear. A ship shaking under attack, friends falling, radios bursting with screams, silences after explosions. In the middle of it all, he was there, standing firm, with an improvised bat in his hand and a group of young people around him, trying not to go crazy, trying to remember that there was still some beauty in the world. And now, more than 60 years later, it was treated as if it had never existed. But something inside him still pulsed, not anger nor revolt. It was something else, a kind of silent strength, the kind that doesn't scream but remains, the kind that no one sees until it's too late. He looked around one last time. Everyone seemed to be going about their business as usual. Too rich to care, too busy to see. And then, at the main gate, with the shadow of the club behind him, George heard something. The muffled sound of tires approaching. A dark car, tinted windows. It stopped right at the entrance, drawing curious glances even from the indifferent ones. But no one knew who was inside. Yet. But George felt something change in the air. And before he could even turn around completely, he heard the door click open. A firm foot touched the floor. And from that moment on, everything began to spiral out of control for those in charge of that place. It's curious how certain presences change everything, isn't it? And even more curious, how time sometimes delivers answers that pride tried to hide. Comment here. Not every hero wears a uniform. The wind blew stronger at that moment, lifting some dust and dry leaves that had accumulated on the edges of the path. George continued with his gaze lowered, his steps becoming shorter and shorter, as if the backpack, light for anyone else, now carried the weight of all the silent defeats that had accumulated over the years. He was in no hurry, but he also had no reason to stay any longer. The security guard stared at the newly arrived black car, trying to figure out if it was someone important, or just another latecomer. George didn't care. Not anymore. Not after everything he had heard. Not after the looks, the muffled laughter, the young man kicking his ball as if he were a walking joke. The truth is that the world he had known no longer existed, and the world that surrounded him now didn't recognize him. Inside, he remembered the lieutenant's words on his last mission. Keep control even when no one else can. You are the last pillar, Miller. But how could he maintain control when everything around him seemed designed to crush any shred of honor? How could he not feel invisible in the face of a country that, deep down, had turned its face away from him? As he pondered, the SUV door opened lightly. First the sound, then the movement. George didn't see who got out. He was staring at a crack in the floor, perhaps trying to find some distraction, some metaphor, some reason not to fall apart completely. But the silence around him changed, and he felt it. The manager, who had walked away satisfied, now walked back hesitantly. The security guards stood still, and the players, who had been laughing and joking before, put down their clubs. The laughter stopped. Even the young man with the cell phone, still recording out of sheer boredom, put his phone down. The room, which had been full of pretension until then, was invaded by a different tension. Something more like respect, or maybe fear. George slowly raised his face, and what he saw made time stand still. A dark-skinned man, wearing a red cap, sunglasses, and a serious expression, walked with determined steps towards him. Tall, familiar, recognized throughout the world. The entire camp knew him. But he only had eyes for George. Tiger Woods. It was him. And he was heading straight for the man who had just been thrown out. George froze. Not in surprise, but in disbelief. Because in his mind, this was impossible. Tiger there. And looking at him, it was as if past and present had suddenly collided, as if someone had opened a crack in time just to prove that not all journeys are forgotten. Tiger stopped a few meters away. "George Miller!" The voice was not one of doubt. It was one of astonishment and reverence. George reflexively reached for the brim of his cap, and he answered in a choked voice, "It is me." Tiger took off his glasses. His eyes were wet. He looked around, at the clubhouse, at the players, at the staff, at all those who had, moments before, unwittingly humiliated a hero. This man taught me everything. In Marine boot camp, when I was just a kid, he taught me how to line up my feet, how to control my breathing, how to hit the ball, not hard, but with respect. George was silent. It was as if his past, which had been ignored for so long, had finally come back to embrace him. Tiger walked over, held out his hand, and as he took it, his eyes fell on the backpack. More precisely, on the medal. The same one that everyone ignored. The same one that some even mocked. That medal. It changed my life. And then he turned to the others. "If this man can't be here, then neither can I." They were simple words, but spoken by who they were, spoken with that weight at that moment. They had the impact of a silent earthquake. The manager stammered. The players hung their heads. And George, he simply couldn't believe it. Because suddenly, the man who was pushed out was the center of the field. The hidden truth was now exposed. The silent prejudice had been unmasked. And that gesture, that unexpected presence, had the power to transform not just an afternoon, but an entire narrative that had been built over years. It was the beginning of a new stage, the breaking of a cycle, an unexpected turnaround full of dignity. That's what we're going to keep talking about. Write in the comments. Honor does not age. The field fell silent, an awkward, dense, almost physical silence. It was as if all the cursed words, all the mocking laughter, all the sidelong glances had frozen in the air, with nowhere else to go. The manager, who had been so confident, swallowed hard. He tried a nervous smile, but no one was looking at him. The focus was elsewhere now. It was George. It was Tiger. It was the truth coming out. Not in the form of speech, but in presence. Tiger was still holding George's hand as he slowly turned to the group who were watching in amazement. "You have no idea who he is." The young man with the cap turned backwards. The same one who had mocked, kicked the ball, filmed the video sarcastically, now didn't have the courage to look up. His camera was still recording, but it was shaking in his hand. Maybe out of shame, maybe out of fear of what that video would mean if it ended up on the internet. George, for his part, remained speechless. Not for lack of words, but for excess of feeling. So many layers were moving inside him at that moment that it was difficult to breathe. The still fresh humiliation mixed with surprise, with emotion, with the bittersweet feeling of being recognized not for a trophy, but for something greater. Impact, legacy, living history. Tiger slowly released him and then looked directly at the manager. This club takes so much pride in its trophies, but none of them are worth half of what this man represents. He shaped me. Not just as a player, but as a man. When my father took me to the Navy base, it was George who taught me that focus, discipline, and respect start within. The manager simply nodded, choking on his own intentions. But there was no more room for excuses here. Something bigger was happening. A public, clear, impossible to ignore turnaround. The masks were falling effortlessly. It was the hidden truth, revealed by a simple gesture, but one that had the weight of a moral avalanche. Tiger turned to George. "If you want to play today, let's play together. Here, now." George hesitated. His hands were still shaking. His body was tired. His heart was racing from holding it all in for so long. But there was an invitation here. And more than that, there was justice. There was a chance to change the narrative, not for the whole world, but for that field, for those eyes, for that young man who thought courage was yelling at an old man. Then he nodded with an almost imperceptible nod, And that was enough. Tiger grabbed George's backpack and carried it with him. They walked side by side back onto the field. And as they did, the world watched. Cell phones now recorded not in mockery, but in reverence. This image, the man who had been sent off, now returning as an honored guest alongside the greatest player of all time, was more symbolic than any gold plaque on the clubhouse wall. George picked up his old putter. The same one. The worn one. The trusty one. He put the ball on the green, took his stance, and breathed. Slowly. Steadily. It was as if time had turned back. Not to the past, but to something deeper. As if life were saying to him, "Now it's your turn." He rolled his shoulders, planted his feet, and hit the ball. The sound of the shot cut through the air like a powerful whisper. The ball flew far, clean, straight, perfect. Everyone watched in silence. Until Tiger smiled and said, "That's exactly how I remember it." George laughed. A shy, almost childish laugh, but filled with relief. It was as if a part of him had healed in that moment, as if the pains of the past, the heavy silences, the unspoken injustices, had finally found a space to come out. And for the first time in many years, he didn't feel ashamed of existing. On the contrary, from that moment on, something changed. The club, the atmosphere, the attitude of the people. The tone changed. The focus of attention changed. Because, on that day, it wasn't just an old man and a champion who were playing. It was two generations united by something greater than titles or medals. It was about respect. It was about legacy. It was about not forgetting. And all of this was still just beginning. Write in the comments, "This is real justice." The first images spread across the networks before the sun even set. A 42-second video. An elderly man holding an old club next to Tiger Woods, hitting a ball with more precision than many champions in international tournaments. No words, no soundtrack. Just the sound of the clean hit, the murmur of the wind on the course, and the attentive silence of those who finally understood that they were witnessing something bigger than the sport. It wasn't about golf. It was about legacy. About memory. About dignity restored before the eyes of those who previously only saw appearances. That same night, searches for the name George Miller exploded. Former teammates, sports reporters, military historians. Everyone wanted to know, who was the man with the humble demeanor and deep gaze who managed to stop the biggest club in the city with a single gesture? The truth is that George never sought fame. He was just looking for a moment. A moment of peace among memories, a field, a ball, and the pleasant silence of the wind. But the world this time did not let it go unnoticed. 2 days later, an extraordinary meeting was called by the club's management. The press was invited, members lined up in elegant chairs, rugs were laid out, and in the center of it all, a simple chair made of weathered wood awaited a man who had never asked for recognition, but who, in all fairness, needed to receive it. George arrived with Tiger riding in. No fancy clothes. Wearing the same faded cap, the same slow walk, the same backpack with the worn zipper and the medal hanging from it. And yet, everyone stood up when he walked in. Not out of protocol, but out of respect. Because sometimes time has to scream for the truth to finally be heard. The club president, visibly uncomfortable, began his speech trying to balance formality with regret. But all it took was a nod from Tiger, discreet, firm, for him to hand the microphone over to the people who really mattered. George didn't like speaking in public. His throat would get tight. His chest ached with memories he had always kept close to his chest. But that day, he felt something needed to be said. Not out of pride, but for all those who, like him, had been forgotten. He looked around. He took a deep breath and said, "I was kicked out of this place not because I did anything wrong, but because my face, my age, my clothes, and my story made people uncomfortable. And I know I'm not the only one." There was a silence, tense, true. During the war, I taught many boys to hold a bat not to win trophies, but to keep their minds sharp, alive, in the midst of chaos. Most of them didn't come home. I did. But inside, I wasn't always whole. He paused for a second, his eyes welling up. Today, because of a gesture, I was seen. And this is what I want to say. Sometimes all a veteran needs is to be seen. That's all. There was no immediate applause. There was silence. A silence filled with awareness. The kind that makes people look inside themselves. At the end of the event, the club announced something unprecedented in its more than 80-year history. The first tournament open to the public, with free admission for veterans and their families, bearing the name of George Miller as patron. The media covered it. The community applauded. But for George, the most important moment came later, and it was much simpler. That same afternoon, as the field was being dismantled, he was walking slowly along the edge of the green, when a boy of about 10 approached him. He was shy, holding a bat that was too new for his small hands. He said nothing. He just held out a folded piece of paper. George opened it. It was a drawing. In the center, 2 men, one young and one old, stand side by side, smiling, holding clubs. Above them, 3 words scrawled in colored pencil. "You inspire me." George smiled. Not the polite smile of someone who is grateful, but the serene smile of someone who, for the first time in a long time, felt complete. There are public tributes, and there are small gestures that really heal. And life still had one more surprise in store for him. Write in the comments, "I believe in this kind of transformation." The field was unrecognizable. Where before there had been only silence and muted judgment, there was now life, color, heartfelt applause. The gate that had once been closed to George now swung open with honor to dozens of veterans, men and women of all ages, many of them in wheelchairs, some using prosthetics, others just looking distant. As if this afternoon was, for them too, a reconnection with something they had left behind. Belonging. George arrived early. He didn't want to be late in his own name. He wore the same cap, the same plain shirt, and still carried the faded backpack. But now, no one saw it as a sign of carelessness. It was a symbol. It was a brand. It was armor. And as soon as he crossed the parking lot, the first boy approached him and extended his hand as if he were touching a legend. "Thank you for existing, sir." George just smiled, that smile that holds back tears and expands the soul. Because he knew what it meant to hear that. He knew what it was like to spend decades being invisible and then suddenly have your story echo in the voice of a stranger. During the opening ceremony, as Tiger gave his speech, George stared at the flag flying in the corner of the field. It was the same one he had carried so many times, folded in his uniform pocket, on days when the world seemed to be falling apart. That flag, to him, was never a symbol of perfection, but of promise. A promise that no one would be left behind. And there, in front of that crowd, he finally felt that this promise was being fulfilled. The tournament began, not with starting guns, or with cameras searching for showcase heroes. It began with hugs, with calloused hands holding clubs, with shy laughter that came out slowly, as if they still didn't know if they were allowed to exist. George was the first to play. The field was more beautiful than he remembered. But his mind still returned, from time to time, to that first day, the day of humiliation. He remembered the manager, the security guards, the young man with the cell phone. And silently, he thanked himself for not having shouted at that moment, for having kept quiet. Because now, that silence had become a cry of honor. When he took the shot, he positioned his feet, braced his shoulders, and held the club with the same technique he had taught hundreds of times to frightened soldiers. And before he took the shot, he closed his eyes. He saw the face of his wife, who had left him too soon. He saw his son, still a toddler, running in a park. He saw his friends who were buried across the ocean. And he felt it. He felt the weight of the journey, of the losses, of the memory that never rests. But he also felt something new. a kind of lightness that only comes when justice comes. The ball left the ground with the elegance of someone who no longer needs to prove anything. Applause rang out, but for George, the loudest sound was his own heart saying, "You win." Late in the afternoon, as the orange sky painted the horizon and the veterans socialized with their families, a press team asked to interview him. He hesitated. He didn't see himself as an inspiration, but he accepted. And when they asked him how he felt about seeing his name on the club's biggest event, he answered simply, "I feel at home. And I'm not talking about the countryside. I'm talking about the people." The reporter smiled, touched, but George still had one more thing to do. He walked to the edge of the lawn. There he saw the same stone bench where, days before, he had sat, head down, humiliated, invisible. He sat down again, but now he was seen. He was respected. He was celebrated. And as he watched the children running around with makeshift clubs, he heard a timid voice nearby. It was the same young man on the cell phone, the one who had filmed him and laughed. Now, without his cap turned around, without irony in his eyes, he extended his hand. Not to shake it, but to give something back. "Your ball. I kept it. I didn't know why. But I thought you'd still use it." George held the ball between his fingers. He recognized the small mark he had made on it decades ago, a faint pen stroke. It was just a golf ball. But at that moment, it carried a universe. "Thank you, son." The boy lowered his head, embarrassed. "Then I'm sorry for what I did." George just put his hand on his shoulder and replied, "You gave me the chance to teach again. And that is priceless." Night was approaching, but it was not an end. It was just the beginning of something new. Write in the comments, "I believe in true redemption." The afternoon wind blew slowly, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and old memories. George stood there, standing in the corner of the field, as if time had slowed down just for him. The sounds around him, laughter, footsteps, distant voices, seemed on a different frequency. His eyes were fixed on the grass where, days before, he had been chased away like an intruder. Now that same ground seemed sacred, and not by magic, but by justice. He held the medal with his thumb, feeling its edges with his eyes closed. That worn, plain, dull piece of metal carried more pain and meaning than any trophy displayed on the club's shelves. It had not been received on a stage, but in a hospital hallway, handed to him by a commander with a hoarse voice and red eyes, after a mission in which half the platoon had failed to return. The medal was for bravery, but George had never liked the term, because he knew that, in practice, bravery is the name given to someone who barely survives and still has to comfort those who are left behind. Tiger stood silently beside him. There was nothing more to say. What needed to be said had already echoed across the country, through videos, articles, stories that spread like wildfire. But there, in that moment, what united the two men was something the public could not see. The silence between their sentences. The respect between their souls. George took a deep breath and let it out slowly. He felt different. Not lighter, but whole. As if he had gathered together all the parts that the world had scattered over time. His poor childhood in the countryside. The war. The invisible return. The silence of the letters that never came. The absence of his son, who had chosen to follow another path. All of this was now part of the same man, and he no longer ran away from it. He turned slowly and walked to the stone bench where it had all begun. He sat there with a certain care, as if he respected even his own body. And for a moment, he stared at the horizon. The sky was taking on shades of gold and pink. The sound of clubs hitting the ground, children's laughter, veterans' footsteps, everything blended into the scene as if life were composing a symphony of redemption. That was when he heard timid footsteps approaching. He looked discreetly and saw the girl. She was about 8 years old, with her hair tied in 2 braids, a loose t-shirt and a badge hanging around her neck with her name written in childish letters. Emily. She was holding something in her hands, as if she were protecting a treasure. George smiled with his eyes. She approached him without saying anything and handed him the gift. It was a drawing. In it, a man in a cap and a child were playing golf side by side, with an American flag in the background and the word hero written in crayon, somewhat crooked in the bottom corner. George held the paper as if he were holding a secret. "Did you draw this for me?" She nodded. "My grandfather was also a veteran. He died last year. But Mom said he would love you very much." George's throat closed for a moment. There were no words, only gratitude. "Thank you, Emily. That's worth more than any medal." She smiled and ran back to her parents. George stood there, motionless, holding the drawing in his lap, next to his backpack. And all the while, the field in the background was still full of life, of veterans, of families, of stories. Each one with their own invisible baggage. But that day, no one was invisible. A club employee approached to hand over something. It was an envelope. George opened it and read it calmly. It was the official invitation to be honored at the State Veterans Memorial Hall, a space previously reserved only for high-ranking military figures, but now he would be there, not because of his title, but because of his history, because of his impact, because of everything that the world almost ignored, but that time has corrected. He carefully tucked the invitation into the inside pocket of his jacket, and in that moment, he realized he was not alone. Behind him, dozens of people had gathered in silence, some with cell phones in their hands, others were just watching, but all of them were looking at him. It was as if the entire field knew that this moment was more than symbolic. It was the closing of a cycle, and the opening of a new one. George stood up slowly, with the drawing in one hand and the medal in the other. He looked at that group, common people, important people, children, old people, veterans, curious people, and everyone saw him, without having to say anything. Sometimes all it takes is for someone to be seen with their heart, for everything else to start changing. Write in the comments. Finally, he was seen. If you've stayed this far, it's because this story touched some part of you too. Maybe it reminded you of someone, or maybe it just made you feel like you do when you find something true. And if so, leave a comment below saying, "I saw the value all the way through," just so you know this message found you the right way. If stories like this make sense for your journey, if they inspire you, or help you see things from a different angle, subscribe to the channel. That's what we do here. Give voice to what the world often forgets. And if at any point in this video, you felt that it was worth it, that you created a connection with George's story, click the like button. This helps this type of content reach more people. But above all, it shows that you value what really matters. There is a video here that completes this conversation with another powerful story. Click on it and continue with me there. There is still a lot of story that needs to be told.